There's a lot we want to get through in the next 15 or so minutes, including the economic and business opportunities that are quite extraordinary. But we should touch first on the war, which is continuing in real time. As I understand it, the U.S. has wound down to an online presence. Its embassies in the region. I think we're probably doing the same. 100,000 Canadians, I believe, in the region. Probably most of you know people who are there. Our hearts are and thoughts are with all of those, as well as the people directly impacted by this conflict. I want to take you back to Friday night and when you got the call that the attack was underway, because in some ways it was the first big test of what you might call the Carney Doctrine, this idea of principles imbued with pragmatism. Okay, here we go. You're in Mumbai, I think, with the Prime Minister. Can you take us into the room and give us a sense of what you and the Prime Minister talked about in that moment?
So we weren't together at the time, and of course he has a program that is sometimes separate from mine, and then sometimes we meet up in a particular event or meeting, and so we actually weren't together. It was the date of the university, and I was actually with the universities, and then he was with the universities, and so I was actually in a room with my deputy minister and some members of his team, and then he came in and we had the conversation about our approach. And in particular, I wouldn't say it was the first test. I would say that we are continually calibrating and implementing the principles of, pragmatism, as well as how do we uphold Canadian values. And for example, I was in Greenland opening up the consulate in Nuuk, and that was an example of the Carney Doctrine, where we're standing for the principles of international cooperation, as well as Greenland's and Denmark's sovereignty, at the same time as trying to understand and execute on some economic relationships between Greenland and Denmark. So apart from that, though, so we're in the room and we have a serious conversation about our long-held view that Iran's nuclear proliferation is unacceptable and contrary to the international agreement that Canada and many other countries are signatories to on nuclear non-proliferation. We have, as a country, have for over 15 years not had diplomatic relations with Iran, given the state-sponsored terrorism that it executes, and certainly the human rights abuses against its people. And we have 18 months ago declared the IRGC as a terrorist entity. So we had a very strongly held view that was really in place last June during the 12-day war that has at its foundation that nuclear proliferation by Iran is unacceptable. At the same time, we want to make sure that we are standing for civilian lives and civilian infrastructure that is necessary to preserve those lives. And so our foreign policy on Iran has been very much focused on individuals. Sanctions that we've put in place, 500 of them, have been focused on individual well-being, and we've been very critical of the reprehensible abuse of human rights, including against women and girls. And so that is the kind of the heart of our foreign policy right now. And you said it, like our top priority right now is the 100,000 Canadians that are in the region. And I was on the phone with foreign ministers of Gulf countries and Middle East countries all weekend. This is in between the meetings, making sure that there are possibilities for Canadians to have supports in those countries, including Oman this morning, who they still have, or had at the time of my conversation with the foreign minister, have airspace that is still viable And so I requested use of that airspace if necessary for Canadian citizens to get out. So there's many, many layers to our foreign policy vis-a-vis this war. And one of those layers involves the protection of civilians and the assistance to Canadian citizens themselves who are being advised to shelter in place.
With respect to the military engagement from the U.S. and Israel itself, though, the Prime Minister was pretty unequivocal. There's often nuanced ways to approach this, as you know. When I first heard his words, I thought, well, there's not a lot of daylight there to parse. And since then, you've heard a number of commentators say this doesn't square with the Davos speech. So help us understand better how you circle that square.
So there is a necessity to uphold our long-held view as a country that the Iranian regime and certainly the proliferation of nuclear capacity is unacceptable, including, in addition, the way that the Iranian regime, as a state sponsor of terrorism, has treated its population. The situation is fluid. Our understanding is, and was at the time, that the intention was to address that nuclear threat. And so, at the same time, we want a diplomatic resolution. We want to protect civilian infrastructure and civilian lives. And so we are very much of the mindset that nuclear proliferation is unacceptable, and death to civilian lives and infrastructure is also unacceptable. And certainly you've seen Iran responding against countries throughout the region: Qatar, UAE, Saudi Arabia, Jordan. And some of these countries have strong missile defense systems, and some of them have less strong defense system. And so the situation is very volatile and very real in terms of the potential for human life to be lost across the region. And that is our main concern always.
Very early hours here in this situation, but what can Canada bring to the table in terms of helping to resolve this?
The question is a good one, because we have a very specific reputation, well earned around the world, as a country that seeks to be an interlocutor, especially in times of tension and conflict. And so that is the point that I'm raising in my conversations with Gulf countries and the Middle East more broadly, to say we would like to play a role in the cessation of hostilities and the diplomatic resolution to the future result between these countries. It is a role that we are seeking to continually play, and our relationships around the world matter a great deal. And so even on the phone this morning with the Foreign Minister of Oman, he said, I appreciate your offer, and I will definitely ensure that we are in touch about further work that we can do together diplomatically, remembering that Oman was the host and played a part in the negotiations that broke off last week.
Let's shift to India, and maybe I can make it India and China, the two great rising economic powers of our time. It's extraordinary how quickly this government has moved with a reset with both countries. It's probably going to be more complicated than that. But what are the signals that you are bringing home, especially to business decision makers from both those markets, others as well, but those two in particular, in terms of what Canadian businesses need to be thinking about
So I'll take you back to the conversation that I referred to with Mark Carney running for office back in January and February last year. And I said to him, what do we need to do to ensure that we actually yield trade diversification? Because my view is and we'd been saying it as a government for some time, that we had significant trade agreements around the world. We were the only G7, we are the only G7 country that has a free trade agreement with every other G7 country. And it was true at the time we were having those conversations as well. So what is missing? Well, right here in this room, this is a very, very important message, is that we had the infrastructure in place from a trade perspective. We need it to be operationalized and utilized. And such is the case with the relationship with India, and we can talk about China, and we can talk about Mercosur and other regional trade arrangements. For example, we're seeking to finalize an FTA with ASEAN in 2026. This is the infrastructure of trade. We are in a moment where the global trading environment and network is being completely reordered. We need all of us to be utilizing the agreements that we are executing, or they will stand there and we will keep having to rely on one trading partner and all the difficulty that that has caused.
Can I push you a bit further on that? Because I've heard this conversation for decades. We need to diversify, and we're making progress over the years, but it's slow progress. What are we in business missing in the equation?
I think, and this is why I wanted to come and have this conversation right after getting off the plane, because I think it's really important to unpack what we are doing internationally so that it's understandable and useful to the business community and the broader Canadian public. And so for that to occur, I think you need to understand what we are doing internationally. You probably should be able to ask your questions so that we can make it accessible. That's what I'm trying to do, make foreign policy and these types of agreements that we are reaching accessible and understandable for businesses to utilize. That will yield actual trade diversification over and above the agreements that we're signing.
It's quite impressive, and I get to see this at RBC, how much global interest there is in Canada now. We're hearing from sovereign wealth funds, from multinationals, from influential people around the world saying we want to move billions, and they do underscore billions, into Canada. You're hearing this as well. And then they stress, but we're not waiting. You have to move this year on some stuff for us to make that portfolio allocation. Maybe give us a better sense of the time pressure here and what we're up against, because you're in rooms in Mumbai, but in lots of other places.
So I'm dealing with my own time pressures, John.
Yeah.
So I'll let you guys figure out yours. But building up to these types of trips, that's where the pressure is for me, because we have to make sure that there is tangible results when we're utilizing taxpayer dollars. I've always been a large proponent of showing value for money, and this is part of what I'm kind of working towards when we're dealing with these time pressures and trips. But we do hope that the CUSMA will be reviewed this year. We are dealing with 85% of our goods are still traversing the border tariff-free. It's on the sectoral tariffs, on the steel, on the aluminum, on the auto sector, on lumber, that we would like to have some movement, obviously. And so that's really where I feel, as a country, the pressure is resting, is on those sectoral tariffs. But again, the CUSMA is relatively favorable, and I mean relative to other countries' experiences.
Yes, we're still kind of have a competitive advantage there, which may not feel great in the moment, but it's less painful than a whole lot of other places have it. Speaking of time pressures, the countdown clock is at 0.
Guys, the light is blinking.
It is
red,
blinking
red,
furious.
Yes.
But
Can we take a couple from the audience?
yes, let me see what has come in, because I've got my
I have some of my
iPad
past
here.
students in the audience, so they know
They all
that I
have
like
better
questions.
questions.
Right, Chad? Yeah.
So we have,
There's a question right there.
yeah, the new era of partnership in terms of Canada and India, quoting the Prime Minister. How confident are you that the new era won't be derailed anymore? We've seen restarts in the past. How is this time different?
So I'm always struck, I didn't know the Prime Minister too well before I decided to run again and all that. I had been a visiting scholar at the Bank of Canada when he was governor. It wasn't like he was coming to get my deep insights into securities law at the time, but I'll say that I'm pretty impressed with his decisiveness and the way in which we are moving very quickly. Looking at my MP colleagues here, because I think we all see that there's a definite path that we are on, and I do not imagine that we will be derailed, period. And you've seen members of the opposition party cross the floor. Perhaps they see that as well.
Another good question here on SMEs and what competitive advantages do you think SMEs should build upon for longer term and successful diversification, and what is the government doing differently now to ensure their success?
Well, first of all, having taught securities and corporate law for so many years, we know that SMEs occupy 97% of our capital markets. And this is an incredible number that we in the government have to digest, that we're not just talking about the top companies listed on the TSX or what have you. So I think this is very much about SMEs, the work we're doing. And in fact, when I talk about people-to-people ties, I really believe that includes SMEs as well. Those companies are largely family-run businesses that are seeking to be able to sell their products or purchase products from India, for example, or any of the other jurisdictions I've mentioned. This is a framework that we need to bring home so that the SMEs can take advantage of the work we're doing internationally. So trade shows, super important. Trade missions. Minister Sidhu is constantly going on trade missions. Those are very important so that Canadian businesses can market their goods in foreign jurisdictions. And so if you want to participate in a trade mission, you can contact his office or my office or your MP, and your member of parliament should be able to connect you to those trade missions.
Those are great pointers, and we shouldn't lose sight of the good infrastructure that has been built over many years. Think of the Trade Accelerator that many in this room and the Board of Trade built. We've been privileged to be part of it at RBC. It's hugely helpful for our clients. We've seen them take advantage of it and profit quite well from it. So we do have tools out there and need to keep adding to it. Minister, the blinking light seems to be blinking brighter and faster.
So red.
Mindful of your
Hard
schedule.
on the eyes after a flight.
I wonder if you could just wrap up with a positive reflection from your trip, and if there was any one point that really gave you confidence, especially for businesses, in terms of what we can do with respect to India, but more broadly to all the wonderful markets out there that we can work with more and more in the future.
I think that there is a positive story here. Despite the very difficult economic environment that we find ourselves in, despite global conflict that is extremely disconcerting and stressful, Canada is on a positive path to growth. Canada has everything the world wants. There is not a room that I go into where people are uninterested in Canada. On the contrary, energy superpower, critical minerals, leader in AI and tech, agricultural products that the world wants. And the Prime Minister has said something on agriculture I think I just have to mention, which is that we will never, as a country, we will never weaponize food. We will not weaponize the food supply chain. We will not use food as a tool of aggression. That is not the Canadian way. We want to partner in a professional manner and trade in accordance with principles that the trading infrastructure of our world is built upon. So these are the types of positive messages that I'm not only receiving but delivering internationally. And I want to thank all of you for the work that you do individually to help our country grow and help our country survive, so that, as I said, we continue to be the greatest country on the face of this planet.
Well, well said, Minister, and what a great illustration of principles imbued with pragmatism, what you just said about agri-food, and there's many, many more. But thank you for your leadership, for your service, and your determination to take Canada forward.
That's right. Thank you.
It's been a
Thank you
pleasure.
so much. Thank you so much.